Comparative politics is often a relatively difficult topic for most students to kind of wrap their minds around, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Comparative politics tends to be a very large field of study. In fact, if you think about it, you could really think of comparative as falling into three very distinctive different ways or types of thinking about this question of politics. The first is to think about comparative politics simply as a field of study. The second is to think about comparative as a methodology, and the third is to think about comparative as being this sort of approach or this broad body of knowledge. So what we're going to talk about in this lesson is very briefly a little bit about each of these three different ways of looking at comparative politics. So first of all, this idea of comparative politics as a field of study. When we think about comparative politics as a field of study, we're talking about this idea of studying comparative politics as an analysis of countries other than the one that you're native to or the one that you grew up in. So for example, when we talk in the United States about studying American politics, in any country of the world other than the United States, American politics would be considered to be comparative politics, comparative analysis. Now, initially, when we began to develop this idea of comparative politics as a field of study, comparative was divided up into broadly two different categories. The first one was to think of studying other countries from the perspective of their laws or their constitutions. So a lot of time would be spent comparing constitutions in ancient Athens or ancient Greece, or comparing the French legal system to the British legal system, and trying to understand how new countries develop their own laws or legal systems. A second way of thinking about it would be to think of it as cultures and religions, and to distinguish between the French people and the British people, or the German people and the Japanese people, and understand how their religion and their culture might be different. In the modern sense, we think of this approach to comparative as a field of study as falling into three broad categories. First, originally, comparative politics in the United States was largely based upon modernization and modernization theory. So we would study other countries with the goal of understanding how did they develop, or with the goal of understanding why are they democracies, or how can we make them democracies. And in this sense, the early days of comparative politics, especially in the West, or in the 20th century anyway, focused on this agenda or goal setting or purposive approach. There's something that we want normatively, like democracy. How do we accomplish that? Somewhere around the 1960s, though, that began to change. This modernization approach focused largely, or conceptualized comparative politics largely as being a sociological phenomenon. How do I change a society to make it into something that I want? Beginning in the 1960s, comparative, like the rest of political science, became increasingly behavioral. There are two marquee indicators of a behavioral approach. The first one is that behavioral approaches tend to focus on the individual or individual decision making. So rather than asking, how do I create a democratic society, I might think, how would I get a person to behave in a democratic way? Or why would you participate in a democracy now but not later? Or when would you demand a democracy? Behavioral approaches also tend to be increasingly empirical. So when we talk about comparative politics as a method, we'll talk about the idea of empirical analysis in a scientific way. The third and probably most recent or most current trend in politics as a field of study is to think about comparative politics from the post-behavioral perspective, or the cultural perspective. This is in some ways a blending of the two. We go back to this original idea of comparative as being the study of religions and cultures and sociological phenomenon, but we do it less judgmentally. The goal with post-behavioral analysis tends to be to understand what makes individual cultures unique and how are cultures similar, rather than trying to think about culture as some sort of a purposive phenomenon. Now, there's some reasons why these transformations took place, and in fact, there's some things that you're going to find very difficult as you're studying comparative politics. When we think about comparative politics as a field of study, what we find is that it's very difficult to remove your own personal biases from the analysis. Our strong tendency is to think about other countries from the lens of being an American or from being a Mexican, and to make comparisons or references back to our own culture or political system. The result is that we often misunderstand what's happening in other cultures, or we try to make value judgments and somehow say that ours is superior to theirs or inferior to theirs for whatever reason. For this reason, some people often question whether or not the study of comparative politics is grounded in reality or is in fact even useful. Can I understand Islam in Saudi Arabia if I am neither Muslim nor am I from Saudi Arabia? If I can't, what good does that do me? If my goal isn't to try to somehow change or reform other societies or my own, why am I even bothering with comparative politics? Is this just simply an exercise in my own personal education? So this is the idea of comparative politics as a field of study.